We've got today is Rob Hargreaves, who's just written a book about Clem Beckett, who was a Speedway legend in the 1930s and also a Spanish Civil War hero. Okay, over to you, Rob.
Right, thank you very much, Bernard, and thank you for inviting me. So I'm going to talk about the subject of the book, the cover of which I think you can see on the screen now, Clem Beckett, motorcycle legend and war hero. And I'm inevitably going to talk about a lot about his life, about the influences on it, and about his contribution and his role in many of the important aspects of history in the interwar period. He was actually born in 1906, which was a sort of fulcrum. Those social historians will know when the first Liberal government was elected. And not that he would know much about it at the time. And that pretty well what Oldham looked like. Cotton was king. And although there were signs of decline, latent signs of decline, one might say, no one could have envisaged the decline in the cotton industry, which was going to follow. It was the sort of town, though, where ambitious politicians would head for to get into Parliament, which is exactly what Winston Churchill did. And you can see, I think, reading between the lines of his letter home to mother, that he wasn't greatly impressed with Oldham. And the quote there does remind me of a similar quote, not by any means with the same meaning, that was made by a certain lady prime minister in the 1980s about there being no such thing as society. That said, Churchill's career was successfully launched in Oldham, and I suppose, given that he was born in Blenheim Palace, he wouldn't feel terribly at home in grimy Oldham. And you can see that Chorlton was a very different place. It was suburban in those days, and although today I think Oldham and the Chorlton are joined by a tram line, I think you'd have had to get on 2 or 3 trams before you could get from Oldham to Chorlton in those days. Back to Oldham, and Clem's birthplace was in fact in Saddleworth, then in Yorkshire, close to Oldham, on the edge of the Pennine Moors. That's all that left. That's all that remains of it. A ruin on the edge of the moors. That's top. The photo on the top left there, and for all the grimy appearance of Oldham, you were never very far away from the openness of moorland. And Clem's early years were spent up there. He developed a love of horses, sense of adventure. And down on the photo on the right shows Glodick Lowes. And that's almost in the centre of Oldham, believe it or not, after looking at the other black and white photograph with all the chimneys and smoke. That's just a little bit to the northeast of the centre. And that is where Clem Beckett was able to practice his motorbike skills very early on in life, as a very early teenager. That is in Swinton Street, that is just near the end on the left-hand side, is this boyhood home where he grew up. He learned about motorbikes, even set up a repair business while still in his teens. And he had the name Daredevil Beckett at a very early age. And that sums up one of the significant themes in Clem's life. He was impatient and very irreverent towards authority. And it I suppose we could say, well, what teenager is not irreverent towards their elders and betters? Clem always said what he thought. He was good at what he did. Whoever you were and whatever you did, he expected you to get it right. And his bluntness got him into trouble. At a personal level, his good looks made him a very popular chap with the girls. And that got him into trouble too. The aftermath of war, where Oldham lost 5,000 of its sons, and his father never went back home, wasn't killed, just didn't go back home. And of course, as well as the Pankhurst in Manchester itself, there were suffrage movements out in towns like Oldham as well. All these things gradually politicized Clem, and they fueled his innate contempt for old fogies. Again, a little known fact is that Oldham had its own crisis, economic crisis, well before 1929. And that was because of greed and the unwillingness to invest in modernisation on the part of the mill owners. And that led to reckless bank lending, tricky trading in the shares, rather like 2008. And there was a big collapse. Clem was a blacksmith's apprentice in 1921, and he was strongly influenced by socialist colleagues at work, who was going to get rid of the old fogies and change things for the better. Because collapses like this, of course, contribute to unemployment and poverty all around the humble surroundings where Clem was growing up. All this fueled his impatience. So in 1923 or 1924, Clem joined the Young Communists, the Young Communist League, after attending a sort of evangelistic recruitment meeting addressed by a firebrand speaker called Tom Mann. Even Clem, as an idealistic young communist, must have seen that some businesses and some entrepreneurs were bucking the trend. And Oldham of Percy Platt was one of them. Again, from very humble background, but he latched on to the growing demand for cars and motorbikes in the aftermath of the First World War. And that demand was maintained during the Depression, which ultimately helped the wider economy to recover. Oldham's own motor company, Bradbury's, went to the wall. You can see an advert for it on Percy Platt's shop window there. But Platt shrewdly bought up its patents. Now, Percy Platt was also to play a significant role in Clem's life, particularly in his later years. In fact, Clem himself was going to rely on his own energies and enterprise pretty well for the rest of his life after quitting his job, more or less at the point he'd served his time as an apprentice for a blacksmith farrier. He was thwarted in his ambition to join the regular army. And he took up the new sport of dirt track racing. Within a year, he'd become a superstar, graduating from amateur rides at former trotting course at Audenshaw near the Snipe Retail Park there on Ashton Moss, to much grander venues like Manchester White City and Belle Vue. It was a pretty arum-scarum sport, this. And you have to say that Clem took to it like a duck to water. Now, although the Speedway Stadium, this, by the way, was all happened in 1928, an explosion of interest brought over by a bunch of Australian riders, so that within 6 months, the whole country was obsessed by this new, noisy, dramatic sport. And Belle Vue, although we now know it as, it's synonymous with Speedway now, and it became the best known track in Manchester, in fact, it was relatively late on the scene. And for a short time, it played second fiddle to Manchester's White City track in Stretford. And you'll have seen that probably anywhere between town and Chorlton, the wonderful neo-classical facade that you pass. I think it's on Chester Road. And Clem was a regular competitor at Belle Vue and a favourite of the crowd. Even after he'd been signed up for Sheffield Owlerton, typically in May 1929, and even by then, the boom was starting to falter a little bit. He won a series of challenge matches against popular rider Frank Very. So people still remember Frank Very. That was in front of a crowd of 30,000 people. And typically at that meeting, Clem had an argument with a bowler-hatted steward who thought that his helmet was too brightly coloured. And this was the most dangerous sport of the time. Injuries were serial, often serious, and sometimes fatal. Experienced riders were supposedly, better able to protect themselves, but some tracks had lax safety standards, and Audenshaw became one of the most notorious for crashes. Clem's fellow rider and director in Sheffield, Spencer Stratton, had once lain unconscious for 23 days following a fall in Australia, where the sport began. And for riders like Clem, success came at a price. Apart from frequent contractual disputes with promoters of, shall we say, dubious character, that price was paid in terms of broken bones, lacerated limbs, head wounds. Now, Clem had amazing resilience and recuperative powers, but others weren't so lucky. There's your White City I referred to, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with the relic, the remains of the building. Thank goodness it was preserved. And you can see that it's fairly obvious from the narrative I put on the photo there that when we say Clem joined the Communist Party, he didn't spend all his time going at meetings or giving out leaflets or selling party newspapers. The money was rolling in, and he was, like any young man, I suppose, he was ready to have a good time. But his energy was boundless, learned to fly a plane, crashed speedway boats on the Cheshire Meres, and drove recklessly on public roads. Now, the thing about Speedway, it wasn't just a sporting achievement, it was a social revolution, because for the first time, working class lads could take part in a motorised sport. It heralded the gradual rollout of car ownership in the 20th century, and other aspects of motorised sport. The tendencies rival those at Old Trafford. Crowds of 10 or 20,000 people were not uncommon. Now, just listen to the contemporary writer A.P. Herbert giving his account, because the new sport created such an impact that all the great and the good went to see it. What was it all about? Heavens, the noise. It's like a million mechanical drills performing in unison. It swells and falls as the riders take the corners. It echoes about the cavernous concrete halls, drowning the feeble acclamations of the crowd. It dies slowly as the riders stop. And at the end of the race, it seems like the end of a battle. Or the special correspondent of the Manchester Guardian, describing the scene at the end of a meeting at White City. When the racing was over, the spectators streamed away from the track in cars, on motor bicycles, in sidecars, on pillions, exploding, ejecting blue flames, honking, rattling like machine guns, the mechanized army of the modern city. Now, just as the Australians had introduced the sport here, it soon became a sport of dirt track, which soon became known as Speedway. They're more or less synonymous. In 1928, British riders like Clem were quick to spot the earning potential for Speedway to take Speedway as missionaries to Europe. They travelled the line of the Orient Express 4 years before Agatha Christie published her famous murder mystery. They brought the thrill of cinder shifting to Turkey, Bulgaria, Romania, and headed north to Germany and Scandinavia. A harebrained scheme to set up a French speedway competition in Marseille was a financial disaster. There they are in Marseille, 1929. Events related by Clem himself make it sound like an episode of the Keystone Cops. After 2 members of the team had been arrested, the men left in France, greatly encouraged, I have to say, by the local gendarmerie and the British consul, and pursued by angry, unpaid landladies, left France in a great hurry. Clem later claimed, somewhat disingenuously, that the episode demonstrated the evils of capitalism, but really it was all more mad than bad. And anyway, Clem himself, although he was never a great speech maker, he loved telling a good yarn, even if it was against himself, in the pub with his mates, like as not. Now, the launch of the Daily Worker in 1930 set in motion a train of events which led inexorably to Clem's death in battle in the Spanish Civil War. At this time, the Communist Party was running a campaign against capitalist sport. Worker sport was good, capitalist sport was bad. And it very much suited them to have a speedway star like Clem denouncing the shenanigans of the dirt track in their columns. Now, talk about reckless. Clem attacked members of the Autocycle Union, that's the sports ruling body, as old fogies in various stages of Anno Domini, most of whom have forgotten what it was, most of whom have forgotten what a motorbike looks like. Interesting that this cartoon comes from the Speedway press, almost as though they could see the class-ridden nature of the sport, but it didn't worry them too much. They almost celebrated it. So it tends to support the Communist Party's characterization of sport as class-riven and class-driven. Clem's foray into journalism got him banned from the tracks by the authorities, and he was already unpopular because of attempts to unionize riders. I don't think I've seen one of these cigarette cards where the information has ever been correct, but even so, it was clearly a good sign of success if you were chosen to feature on a cigarette card. So there's Clem more or less at the height of his career in 1930 when he was based in Sheffield. Now, this chap, for people who remember Belle Vue with all kinds of feelings of affection and so on, this chap, Eric Oswald Spence, was almost the personification of Belle Vue in the 1930s, late 20s and 30s. He was the manager of Belle Vue, and he was executive of its parent company, International Speedways Limited. He was a great fixer of Northern Speedway in Clem's day. It was his ruthlessness that carried through a rationalisation policy, and he'd put the smaller tracks like Audenshaw and other regional tracks in places like Burnley and Rochdale. He put them out of business, and it eventually rendered Clem's shareholding in the Sheffield company worthless. With the era of the auto union, cycle union, Spence was almost certainly involved in getting Clem banned. Yet, in the aftermath of Clem's death, Spence, it was, who paid the most fulsome tribute to him as the most exciting figure on the tracks. Then in 1929 comes the Wall Street crash, followed by the Great Depression and the economic slump of the 1930s. The Manchester mills were hit, Northwest mills were hit. Wave of closures, far worse than the one occurred that I referred to earlier, the flotation boom. Men without jobs, families reduced to an existence determined by the means test. As with cotton, so with Speedway. What's the answer? Well, rationalisation. Shut down mills, shut down looms, shut down tracks, reduce the number of riders, reduce the number of venues. Now, naturally, the Communist Party thought that the slump would create the right conditions for revolution. A bit like the generals in the First World War, one last push, and we'll have the Germans licked. And as the disasters of the 1920s unfolded, each one, like the general strike a few years earlier, then the Depression in the early 1930s, it seemed to men like Harry Pollitt and the dedicated leaders of the Communist Party of Great Britain that revolution was always just round the corner. Well, Clem launched another attack on members of the sports ruling body. This was getting on for 1932. This time in the work of sportsmen. Further article in like vein was published a few weeks later, alleging that Speedway was riddled with financial corruption. Now that really was a professional suicide note in two parts, because at that time the ACU was actually considering lifting the ban on Clem. Now there was no chance of that coming about. So Clem became more and more involved in the Communist Party, or activity sponsored by them. He became a titular vice president of the British Workers' Sports Federation. That was affiliated to the Communist Party, which had organised the mass trespass on Kinder Scout in April 1932. Now, there is no evidence that he actually took part, that Clem's boots were actually on the ground on that day in April in 1932, when Benny Rothman, also a member of the Communist Party, by the way, led the now famous mass trespass. interesting point, though. Very recent research has shown that as many as 15, maybe more, of the mass trespassers later went on to fight in the Spanish Civil War. In his last years, after taking part in this communist sporting tour of the Soviet Union, Clem set up a motorcycle business in Oldham Road, Manchester. And he married a Danish girl he'd met on his travels, who was also a communist. But it should be remembered he still kept close links to Oldham, employing his two lifelong friends, Eli Anderson and Irving Anderson. Incredibly, no relation to each other. So there was that aspect of Clem's character, loyalty. It was a very strong feature of his character, and as well as one would have to say, great sportsmanship in Speedway itself. On this tour, by the way, in the tour of the USSR, which was, you can imagine, was constructed as a propaganda exercise both for the British Communist Party and the Soviet authorities at that time. There's not a lot of evidence that's come to light yet, but what evidence there is suggests that Clem was far from enamored by what he saw in the Soviet Union, although other members of the delegation were. He apparently was the star of the show at, for example, the Moscow Dynamo Stadium, where on his own, he roared round on his dirt track bike to the acclaim of Muscovites. Not a competition, just going around broadsiding the quintessential feature of a speedway event, dramatic, noisy, and so on. And naturally, Clem was influenced and worked with the Jewish community in Cheetham Hill to oppose Mosley and to make sure that he and his toughs never got control of the streets in Manchester. And in that, I think it's fair to say they succeeded. Clem was forced to earn a living as a Wall of Death performer. Now, if he got upset about the lax safety standards in Speedway, there were virtually none in Wall of Death riding. It was an entertainment, not a sport, with no regulations so far as I'm aware. And the photograph there showing Clem wearing headgear was probably only the case because of some fairly spectacular falls. I suppose the most spectacular was falling in front of the King of Denmark. Yes, that's Percy Platt there to the right of the picture. We saw him, we think it was him, out in the sidecar passenger outside his shop several years before. He'd branched out in the meantime as a sort of agent, showbiz agent, looking after Clem's interests and other performers on the Wall of Death, and traveling Europe and the Middle East in that capacity. I discovered documents which, when I was researching, that unfortunately showed that Platt was anti-Semitic and had, at that time, sympathies with Hitler. However, there they are in a boat together, and that's only, we think that's 1936, the year the Spanish Civil War broke out. So that must have been the spring, perhaps, when Clem and Percy Platt were in Denmark. I think Clem was really acting as a gopher by this stage, looking after Platt's other riders, helping with arrangements, helping with the erection of all the stuff they had to put up and take down as these Wall of Death shows toured the country. When the Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936, the vast majority of the British population was indifferent to the fate of the struggling democratic government, undermined by an army revolt and aided by the fascist powers of Hitler's Germany, Mussolini's Italy. But the Communist Party of Great Britain, working through the Comintern and other European communist parties, saw the need to oppose fascism. Clem's volunteering to drive an ambulance to Spain and then to join a fighting unit, it came from simple belief, as with so many other of the volunteers, that it was necessary to confront evil and not to appease it. You can probably recognize Clem, second from the right, and next to him, on the extreme right, is a man called Christopher St. John Sprigg, nom de plume Christopher Caldwell, and their destinies were now fatally linked. There's a possibility that one of the chaps in the middle of that photograph is Stephen Spender, the poet. By the time Clem arrived in Spain, the Moorish troops of General Franco were at the gates of Madrid. Yet the press in Britain was more interested in the antics of Edward VIII and Mrs. Simpson and the abdication crisis. It was a time in Spain amongst the recruits to the British battalion, such as St. John Sprigg and Clem Beckett, time of a dramatic time for them, in which they show very great bravery in standing with the Spanish people against the overwhelming force, brute force of the nationalist army, as I said, supported by overwhelming superiority in weaponry and aeroplanes provided by Hitler and Mussolini. The Battle of Jarama in February 1937 was the first big engagement for the British battalion. Members of the battalion had fought before Christmas, before Christmas 1936, but the battalion, British battalion as such, had its baptism of fire at Jarama. It was part of the 15th International Brigade, fighting alongside French, Eastern Europeans, and an American contingent. They were intended, the British battalion and the others' mission was to stop the fascist encroachment to encircle Madrid. Their attempt, they were trying to cut the Madrid-Valencia road. And notwithstanding a 3-day onslaught and terrible casualties inflicted on the International Brigades, Franco's plan to encircle Madrid was indeed thwarted. The line held, but the British paid a terrible price. of the 650 men of the battalion, of the 650 men of the battalion, only 80 survived unscathed. Clem was among the 250 killed on the first day, manning a light machine gun alongside Christopher St. John Sprigg. And they were covering the retreat of hundreds of wounded comrades trying to get off the hillside, which became known as Suicide Hill. That's more or less where the map is located. That is the sunken road, which was a crucial feature of the battlefield because it provided a location for the battalion headquarters and for the men who managed to get off the valley floor at some safety, so to death. It was significant that the memorial service for Clem Beckett was held in Manchester, not Oldham. Of the 2,500 British and Irish volunteers, who went to Spain, more than 500 were killed, and the majority of the survivors were wounded, obviously many of them very seriously. Several men from South Manchester were among those who did not return. Eddie Swindells from Didsbury, Fred Biono from Rusholme, Bob Ward, Hume, and Philip Goodman, Fallowfield. Taylor claimed that the Spanish Civil War was an event that only concerned the intellectual elite of British society. He was wrong about that. And Greater Manchester was one of the places that proved him wrong. Its population did all they could to help alleviate suffering of the Spanish people. Even as here, arranging food ships to get out to Spain, the poor people of Spain, starving towards the end of the war as Franco moved in for the kill. February 1939 is only a couple of months before Franco's final victory. And it was then the International Brigades had been withdrawn, and it was fairly obvious they were going to lose the war, but people still wanted to help the Spanish people. The Spanish Relief Committee raised thousands of pounds towards food ships and towards supporting refugees, especially children, and especially the children from the Basque Country. And there's Chorlton's very own Majadi, serving as a nurse. I know you will have heard a lot about her from Chris Hall and the great book he wrote about her. I know that she was born in Chorlton on Medlock, but did live a long time in Chorlton cum Hardy. The book was called, as you know, The Nurse Who Became a Spy. And she too also became a key figure in raising money for medical aid before being taken prisoner in Spain. And that's on Manchester Road. I'm sure a lot of you might have been there when it was unveiled, and a lot of you will know where it is and perhaps pass it daily. Quite soon after the Second World War, because as you'll see from the dates there, Second World War, as anti-fascists had predicted, as the Communist Party had predicted, the Second World War broke out anyway, despite appeasement, only a few months after Franco had triumphed in Spain. But quite soon after the end of the war, excuse me, people were demonstrating to keep the memory of the fallen international brigaders like Clem Beckett, to keep that memory alive. Now, this is 1948 in Manchester, and the little lad on the right is no other than Mike, this chap here. It's Mike Wilde, and he was the son of Hardwick-born Sam Wilde, the last commander of the British battalion, and whose sister Dolores, I'm honoured to have in amongst today's Zoom attenders. Now, these victims of and descendants of victims of Francoism are demonstrating in Madrid against the immunity of politicians, army officers, and civil servants for their part in the years for their part in the 35 years of Franco dictatorship which followed his victory in war. They want the laws to rescue, they want new laws to rescue what they call historical memory. And somewhere beneath 100 and 200,000 people, somewhere between 100 and 200,000 people were murdered, either shot, worked, starved, or tortured to death under Franco, and their bodies dumped in secret mass graves. Los desaparecidos. Obviously, you have a tyranny and people disappear. We don't bother with courts of any kind whatsoever. Knock on the door, not even a knock on the door, just disappear, or enemies, and that went on for a long time. I'm pleased to say that, I should have said while we were looking at that photograph, that the exhumations of these mass graves are now proceeding in Spain, and it is not beyond the realms of possibility that one day the body of Clem Beckett will be located and identified by the use of modern DNA techniques. Exhumations at Jarama have already begun. This is the plaque currently housed in Manchester Central Library, commemorating the 30 or so men from Greater Manchester who were killed in Spain, that includes Clem Beckett and 13 others Manchester men who died at Jarama. It bears the words of Spanish politician Dolores Ibarruri, known as La Pasionara, who paid tribute to their sacrifice with immortal eloquence. When the years pass and the wounds of war are staunched, speak to your children and tell them of the International Brigades, of men who reached our country as crusaders for freedom, who gave up everything, and of whom many remain with the Spanish earth for their shroud. Addressing the departing survivors of the International Brigade in Barcelona, she told them, "You can go proudly. You are history. You are legend." And a lighter note to end on. As dirt track aficionados will know this year, Belle Vue Speedway team ended their season by winning the league championship for the first time since 1993. And I'm sure that for all his battles with Eric Oswald Spence, Clem Beckett himself would have raised a cheer. No pass around. They shall not pass. So you can read more about all this in my book, but I'm very happy to answer.
Yeah. Anybody with any questions?
Three things. One is that Robert did mention that the team we beat the other night, in the last fortnight, home and away, was the Sheffield team, actually, which of course was mentioned in the beginning of the talk, which was fascinating. Another thing was that my brother was a speedway rider for Belle Vue for 11 years. he rode in the late the 50s and early 60s. And three of his pals, Rob was right, what a dangerous sport it was. Three of his best friends were killed. One I used to ride cycle speedway with, a lad called Derek Maynard, buried in Stockport. Another was a very famous rider called Peter Craven, who was noted to be, or thought to be, one of the best riders ever. Thank you.
Okay, Frank.
Yeah, thank you.
I just dug out a book here by Christopher Cordwell.
Oh.
The Polymath.
Oh, yes.
Illusion and Reality,
yes.
A study of the sources of poetry.
Yes.
It would be fantastic if they find his body.
Well, absolutely. You know, they're likely to be together. We don't know what the Moors or Spanish troops would have done once they'd conquered the battlefield. The odds are they'd have just been left or hastily dispatched into the earth.
I've got something actually I want to show you, which is when we had a previous talk on Belle Vue, we looked at the Speedway. It's just about 30 seconds of an old Speedway, and I thought some people might like to see what it looks like. So I'm going to try and show it to you.
The first meeting was held at this stadium under the control of the North Manchester Motorcycle Club, run by E.O. Spence.
Volume.
Was soon to move to a purpose-built stadium, returning here in 1988.
Very skilled.
Very dangerous.
Oh. Let's like this.
Very good.
Yeah.
Okay, well, look, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Rob. That was really, really interesting. Can we have a ragged round of applause, usual Zoom way?
Certainly.
Thank you for listening, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.